What if I told you that the most dazzling diamonds in history were bought at the cost of broken women's lives? The Gilded Age and late Victorian era went down in history as a time of incredible luxury, revelry, and grandeur. But behind the facades of the marble mansions of New York and London lay a very different, dark reality that was not spoken of aloud. It was a time when women, dressed in silk and velvet, often felt like prisoners in the most expensive prison in the world. The glare of the chandeliers overshadowed their tears, and the strict rules of etiquette suffocated them more than tight corsets. Watch the video to the end to find out how a single mistake in choosing a dress could destroy a lady's reputation forever, and what a terrible price the heiresses of millions paid for the title of Duchess. What if I told you that everything you believed about the romance of the past is not true? In the world of high society at the end of the 19th century, marriage was rarely a union of two loving hearts. It was a cold, calculated deal, reminiscent of a merger between two large corporations where feelings carried no weight. The parents of wealthy American brides craved aristocratic titles to establish themselves among the elite, while impoverished British lords desperately needed dollars to repair their crumbling castles. The girls in this game became nothing more than bargaining chips, bearer checks wrapped in expensive lace. No one asked for their opinion, and any attempts at resistance were suppressed by harsh psychological pressure from their mothers. Young heiresses were prepared for this moment from an early age, instilling in them a sense of duty to their families. They were told that love was the lot of commoners, and that a lady should think about her position in society and the honor of her family name. Often the groom was twice the bride's age, not particularly handsome or pleasant, but possessed the coveted coat of arms. The first meeting of the future spouses could take place just a couple of days before the engagement was announced. The girl saw before her a stranger, a cold person with whom she was to spend the rest of her life. Fear of the unknown was mixed with a feeling of hopelessness, but there was no turning back. On their wedding day, which newspapers described as a fairy tale celebration, many brides walked down the aisle with tear-filled eyes. Hidden beneath layers of expensive veils were faces contorted with despair, which guests mistook for excitement. The church vaults, decorated with thousands of white lilies, resembled the set of a tragic play. Vows of fidelity were spoken in quiet, trembling voices, sounding like a sentence on one's own freedom. At that moment, the heavy golden door of the cage closed invisibly behind the bride. Society rejoiced, discussing the cost of gifts and the brilliance of tiaras, oblivious to the personal tragedy of the main character. After a lavish reception, the newly minted duchess or countess set off on a new life, which often turned out to be a nightmare. Moving across the ocean meant a complete break with former friends, habits, and her family home. She found herself in a foreign country where the climate was harsh and the people were prim and unfriendly. The husband, having received his long-awaited dowry, often lost all interest in his young wife immediately after the honeymoon. He returned to his habits, clubs, and hunting, leaving his spouse alone in a huge, cold mansion. Do you agree with this? Please tell us what you think about this. Is it possible to find happiness in a marriage of convenience? Every opinion is valuable. Are you ready to learn the truth about what awaited American brides in English estates? Upon arriving at her husband's ancestral castle, a young woman often experienced a real cultural and domestic shock. Instead of cozy, steam-heated New York mansions, she found herself in stone structures where damp cold had reigned for centuries. These ancient walls had no running water, no proper lighting, and none of the basic amenities she was accustomed to. Drafts swept through the long corridors, forcing her to wrap herself in shawls even in summer, and in winter, the water froze in the wash basins right in her bedroom. The attitude of her new relatives and servants was often openly hostile or contemptuous. The aristocrats looked down on the dollar princess, considering her an ill-mannered upstart, good only for paying the bills. Her mother-in-law refused to give up her place as mistress of the house for years, criticizing her daughter-in-law's every move and every decision. Servants loyal to the old owners sabotaged the new lady's orders, pretending not to understand her accent. The feeling of loneliness was intensified by the fact that there was not a single kindred spirit around with whom she could simply talk. Life on the estate was subject to a strict, centuries-old routine that could not be broken. Breakfast, a walk, changing clothes, lunch, tea, dinner. Everything happened at the ringing of a bell. Any attempt to change the menu or the time of serving meals was perceived as an attack on the foundations of the British monarchy. The woman felt not like a hostess, but like a guest who had overstayed her welcome and was getting in everyone's way. She had to fight for the right to rearrange the furniture in her own room or order new curtains. The huge libraries were full of books, but the young wife was often discouraged from reading them so as not to be labeled a blue stocking. All she could do was wander around the art gallery, looking at portraits of her husband's ancestors, who stared at her with disapproval. These painted people seemed more like the real owners of the house than she did. She felt like a ghost wandering through the scenery of someone else's life. But even this icy existence was not the most terrible ordeal for the psyche. In the next chapter, you will learn what invisible torture awaited women every day, forcing them to hate their own bodies. What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries as a method of treating people, but at the time it was the norm in fashion. This is not just about clothing, but about daily, exhausting physical torture elevated to the rank of art. The ideal hourglass silhouette required the waist to be cinched to unnatural sizes, 45-50 centimeters. The corset was not just underwear. It was a rigid frame made of whalebone and steel that deformed the ribs and compressed the internal organs. Women literally could not breathe deeply, taking only short, shallow breaths. The morning began with a lacing procedure that could take up to half an hour and required the help of a maid. The maid pressed her knee against her mistress's back, tightening the laces until the waist reached the desired circumference. This was accompanied by pain, dizziness, and darkening of the eyes, but it had to be endured in order to meet the standards. This armor could only be removed late at night before bedtime. All day long, the body was in a vice, restricting any movement and causing constant discomfort. But it wasn't just the corset, because layers of other clothing were worn on top of it. Petticoats, bustles, pads, bone bodices. The total weight of the outfit could reach 15-20 kilograms. Carrying such a heavy load throughout the day was incredibly physically exhausting. In the summer heat, the layers of fabric created a sauna effect from which there was no escape. Sweat poured down the body under the corset, causing skin irritation and unbearable itching that could not be scratched. The most dreadful requirement of etiquette was the need to change clothes several times a day. A morning dress, a walking dress, a visiting dress, a tea dress, a dinner dress. Each event required a change of attire. This meant that women spent hours in front of the mirror, taking off and putting on complex structures. This was no less exhausting than hard physical labor in the fields. She had no time to just be herself. She was a living mannequin. Constant corset wearing led to chronic health problems, which were shamefully kept quiet. Organ displacement, digestive problems, back muscle atrophy, constant fainting. Such was the price of beauty. The famous feminine weakness and pallor were a direct result of oxygen deprivation. Women fainted not from an excess of emotion, but from the inability to breathe. And even in this state, the first thing they did was check their posture for propriety. It was practically impossible to eat in this tight corset, so portions at dinner parties were tiny. The stomach was so constricted that any extra bite caused pain and nausea. High society women often lived in a state of constant semi-starvation. This was considered a sign of refinement and aristocracy, although in reality it was slow exhaustion. Food became not a pleasure, but another torment. Thank you for watching. Where are you watching us from? What interested you most about these crazy fashion demands? Share a like if you enjoy delving into history. Guess how much time a woman of high society had to herself each day? The answer may shock you, not a minute. A lady's life was scheduled down to the second, turning into an endless marathon of obligations. From the moment she woke up until she went to bed, she was under the scrutiny of prying eyes and strict rules. There was simply no free time in this schedule when she could just sit in silence or do what she loved. The morning began with sorting through correspondence, which was not entertainment but hard work. She had to personally respond to dozens of invitations, thank you letters, and polite notes. Each occasion had its own type of paper, its own wording, and its own rules of etiquette. A mistake in addressing a titled person could cause serious offense. Ladies usually did not have secretaries for personal correspondence, and they would sit at their desks for hours, writing calligraphic lines. Then came visiting season, a complex and pointless ritual of exchanging cards. Ladies would get into a carriage and visit the homes of acquaintances, leaving their calling cards or stopping in for 5 minutes for a formal conversation. There were strict rules: who to visit first, how long to stay, what to talk about. Failure to return a visit was considered a gross insult that could lead to exclusion from the circle of the elite. It was an endless race around in circles, devoid of any human warmth. Lunches and charity bazaars filled the middle of the day, requiring constant composure. At these events, it was impossible to relax. One had to keep up appearances and engage in small talk. A woman was always on stage, playing the role of the perfect representative of her class. Any slip-up, bad joke, or tired look immediately became the subject of gossip. She was a living showcase of her husband's success, and that showcase had to shine. But what if the pressure of the spotlight became unbearable, and a woman made a mistake? In the next chapter, you will learn how cruelly society punished those who stumbled. In a world where reputation was more valuable than gold, the slightest mistake could cost a woman her life. Social death was a very real concept and frightened high society ladies more than physical death. The mechanism of exclusion from society was ruthless and irreversible, working as precisely as a guillotine. One wrong glance, one careless word, or one appearance in inappropriate company was enough. The judges and executioners were yesterday's friends and influential matrons who held the guest lists in their hands. The most terrible punishment was the so-called cut, outright ignorance when meeting. If an influential lady walked by, looking through a woman as if she did not exist, it was a signal to everyone else. From that moment on, the doors of the best houses were closed to the victim forever. She was no longer invited to balls. Her letters were not answered, and she was ignored at the opera. She became invisible, a ghost that everyone diligently avoided so as not to be infected with bad luck. The reason for ostracism could be not only a real misdemeanor, but also simply malicious gossip. Rumors spread like wildfire, becoming embellished with monstrous details. It was impossible to defend oneself against slander, as any excuses were perceived as confirmation of guilt. Women were defenseless against collective opinion, which required no proof. Often, the victims were the most beautiful and vibrant women, whose popularity aroused envy. Divorce was an absolute taboo and a stigma that could not be washed away. A divorced woman was automatically removed from the list of respectable people, regardless of the reasons for the breakup. Even if the husband was a tyrant, a gambler, or a cheater, the wife was always considered guilty for failing to preserve the family. She lost not only her status, but often the opportunity to see her loved ones, who turned away from her to save their own reputations. It was complete isolation. The financial collapse of the family also fell heavily on the shoulders of women. If the husband went bankrupt, the wife had to bear this cross with dignity, saving on everything but maintaining appearances. Appearing in an old dress or not having a carriage was noticed instantly and caused a wave of contemptuous whispers. Former friends disappeared like rats from a sinking ship, leaving the family alone with their misfortune. Poverty in this circle was considered a vice, a contagious disease. An atmosphere of universal distrust and hypocrisy poisoned the air in the most luxurious drawing rooms. Smiles were fake, and compliments often concealed veiled insults. But what happened to those who made no mistakes, but simply could not withstand the pressure? What if I told you that the cure for depression in that era was worse than the disease itself? Women whose psyches could not withstand the pressure of the gilded cage often fell into the hands of fashionable neurologists. Any manifestation of sadness, apathy, or desire for independence was branded with a diagnosis of hysteria or nervous disorder. Instead of understanding and support, the unfortunate women received barbaric treatment designed to break their will completely. The most popular and cruel method was the so-called rest. The essence of treatment by rest was the complete sensory isolation of the patient. The woman was locked in her bedroom, put to bed, and forbidden to get up, read, write, sew, or even talk. She was instructed to lie motionless for hours, staring at the ceiling or the patterns on the wallpaper. It was believed that any mental activity depleted the weak female brain and harmed the reproductive system. In fact, it was imprisonment in her own home under the supervision of nurses. Nutrition during such a course was forced and excessive. Patients were forced to drink liters of fatty milk and cream and eat high-calorie foods to restore their vitality. Refusal to eat was seen as a symptom of the disease and was suppressed. Women quickly gained weight, became flabby and apathetic, losing the last remnants of their self-confidence. They turned into overfed, spineless creatures, completely dependent on those around them. This method did not cure depression, but drove it deep inside, bringing it to the brink of madness. The inability to occupy the mind with anything led to hallucinations and obsessive ideas. The wallpaper began to move. Shadows took on sinister shapes, and silence rang in the ears. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's famous story, The Yellow Wallpaper, was written about just such an experience and the horror of slowly going mad. The woman screamed for help, but her cries were perceived as another bout of hysteria. But even those who escaped the doctors could not escape another, no less terrible fate. In the next chapter, we will talk about how luxurious interiors became the backdrop for the loneliest dramas. The luxurious mansions of New York and London were designed to impress guests, not to provide comfort to their owners. Huge ballrooms, marble staircases, enfilades of rooms with high ceilings. All this created the feeling of living in a museum. People felt lost in these spaces, small and insignificant. The architecture emphasized the distance between people, separating them with long corridors and heavy doors. A husband and wife could live in the same house and not see each other for days, inhabiting different wings. A woman's private quarters, her boudoir and bedroom, were the only place where she could take off her mask. But even here, the atmosphere was often oppressive and overloaded with details. Heavy velvet curtains blocking out the light, massive dark wood furniture, countless knickknacks gathering dust. The air in these rooms was stale and stagnant. They were golden cages upholstered in silk, where time passed slowly and viscously. The mirrors reflected not a happy hostess, but a lonely figure, frozen in anticipation of something that would never come. The silence in these houses was special, echoing, and frightening. The sound of footsteps was muffled by thick carpets. Voices were muffled by tapestries. It seemed that the house itself was watching over its inhabitants, absorbing their secrets and sorrows. In the evenings, when the guests left, the mansion was plunged into darkness, dispelled only by the faint light of candles or gas lamps. Shadows danced in the corners, creating the atmosphere of a Gothic novel, where the heroine is locked in a castle with ghosts. Women often tried to fill this void with things, endlessly buying vases, figurines, and paintings. It was shop-aholism born of despair, an attempt to buy emotions and novelty. Rooms were turned into warehouses of expensive items, with no room for real life. Things displaced people, becoming more important than their feelings. A random scratch on a lacquered table could cause a greater tragedy than the tears of the hostess. Separate bedrooms for spouses were the norm, symbolizing the emotional gap between them. The door connecting the husband's and wife's rooms was often locked or opened only on a schedule. Intimate life was reduced to marital duty, devoid of passion and tenderness. The woman spent her nights alone, in a huge cold bed under a canopy, listening to the sounds of the house. This physical loneliness was perhaps the hardest trial. There was another side to this drama of female loneliness. Men who were physically present but emotionally absent. Aristocratic upbringing and social norms turned husbands into cold, detached statues. Showing feelings was considered a weakness unworthy of a gentleman. From childhood, they were taught to restrain their emotions, to be tough and authoritative. As a result, women did not get a partner in their husbands, but a statue, closed in its armor of propriety and tradition. The life of a man of high society ran parallel to that of his family, with almost no overlap. He spent most of his time in closed gentlemen's clubs, where women were strictly forbidden. There, in clubs filled with cigar smoke and the smell of whiskey, their real life unfolded, with political debates, card games, and casual conversation. They returned home only to change for dinner or sleep, treating their homes like hotels. Hunting, horse racing, yachting, and traveling took up months of the year. Husbands went on expeditions to Africa or India, leaving their wives alone for 6 long months. Letters were rare and dry, containing reports on trophies and the weather. Women were not companions in these adventures. They were merely those who waved handkerchiefs at the pier and waited faithfully for their return. Her world was static. His world was full of movement. Having a mistress was not just the norm, but almost a mandatory attribute of a wealthy man. Actresses, dancers, or simply ladies of the night received the attention, passion, and generosity that their lawful wives were deprived of. Men sought the lightheartedness and fun they couldn't find in the stuffy living rooms of their homes. Wives were expected to know about this and keep quiet, maintaining their dignity. Scenes of jealousy were the height of impropriety. In a society where a woman's value was determined by her appearance and ability to shine, old age was a death sentence. As soon as the first gray hairs appeared and wrinkles formed around the eyes, a woman began to feel the icy breath of oblivion. The cult of youth in the age of splendor was cruel and uncompromising. A woman was a commodity, and her marketable appearance had to be maintained at all costs, otherwise she would be written off. The fear of aging turned into real panic, a daily battle with nature that could not be won. All available means were used, often dangerous and poisonous. Creams containing arsenic and mercury, lead white, skin cauterization with acid. Ladies were willing to endure any pain and risk for the illusion of freshness. They slept in masks made of raw meat, drank dubious elixirs, and tightened their corsets even tighter in an attempt to regain their girlish slenderness. The mirror became their main enemy, bringing bad news every morning. With age, the attention of men, to which they had become addicted like a drug, began to wane. They were invited to balls less and less often, their places taken by young debutantes, fresh, rosy-cheeked, full of life. Yesterday's queen of the ball turned into a respectable matron whose role was to sit by the wall and watch other people's celebrations. It was a painful fall from grace, a loss of power and influence that had been based solely on beauty. Husbands, who had never been particularly faithful, now openly took young mistresses without any shame in front of society. The wife had no choice but to endure this humiliation, pretending that she was above jealousy. She became a mommy, the keeper of the hearth, but ceased to be a woman in the eyes of her spouse. The feeling of her own uselessness and inferiority ate away at her soul. Clothing for older ladies was austere, dark, and heavy, as if mourning their lost youth. Bright colors, low necklines, and jewelry were considered inappropriate for a woman of a certain age, even if she was only 45. Society itself forced them into the confines of old age before their time, forbidding them to be attractive. Any attempt to dress fashionably and youthfully was met with ridicule and whispers behind their backs. She's forgotten how old she is. When the lavish funeral was over and the last carriage left the cemetery, little remained of the socialite's glamorous life. A cold marble monument with her husband's name carved on it, where she was referred to only as his faithful wife. A few lines in an obituary listing her charitable deeds and receptions, and perhaps a portrait in the gallery in which she is forever young and smiling mysteriously, hiding her secret. The legacy of these women was not their thoughts, feelings, or talents, but their possessions. What remained were jewelry boxes over which the heirs would later fight, without thinking about how heavy they were for the one who wore them. There were dresses that would eventually decay in museums or attics, turning to dust. There were diaries that were often burned to hide family secrets and indecent experiences. Women's voices were erased from history, drowned out by the roar of their husbands' achievements. Railroads, factories, politics. But behind these material traces lay a deep trauma, passed down from generation to generation. Daughters who witnessed their mother's misfortune often repeated their fate, knowing no other way of life. They also married for convenience, endured the coldness of their husbands, and suffered from loneliness. It was a vicious circle of pain, masked by etiquette and tradition. The golden cage was passed down as the most valuable heirloom. Only a few dared to break the circle, becoming suffragettes, writers, or simply independent women. They drew strength from rejecting the experience that had ruined their mothers. But even they carried the mark of this ancestral sadness, the memory of silent tears in velvet boudoir. The history of women's emancipation is largely a history of escape from those very luxurious mansions that seem like paradise from the outside. We have touched on the secret history of women whose lives seem like a fairy tale, but in reality were a drama full of silent suffering. Behind the glitz of the Gilded Age lay millions of invisible tears shed into pillows made of the most expensive silk. These women were victims of their time, hostages to wealth and status, deprived of the right to simple human happiness. What other secrets of the past would you like to uncover with us? Write in the comments about the topics that interest you, whether it's the fate of servants, the secrets of royal courts, or the history of fashion. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new journeys into history.